Hello, Tom. Welcome to ATC Office Hours. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Micah.
We are going to talk some turfgrass ecology and talk about lawns. For those of you who don't know, Tom Cook was the longtime turfgrass head of the turfgrass program at Oregon State University, and he was my professor. He taught me many turfgrass classes when I was a student at Oregon State in the 1990s, and I'm just thrilled to talk with Tom today because has he studies lawns in a very interesting way. I think a very practical way. He often will tell me that he's been looking at a particular lawn from the time it was planted, year after year after year, and seeing what's growing and seeing what happens. So I'm going to let Tom do most of the talking, but um, you do that, don't you, Tom? You look at lawns over time.
I do. I've been doing it for a long time, and you know, it's interesting. When I first got involved with turf management, I liked the idea because I considered it to be a real finite science. You had X number of grasses, X number of weeds, X number of fertilizers, so on and so forth, and I sort of bought into the party line that if you were in Spokane, Washington, you'd plant Kentucky bluegrass and it would stay there and everything was wonderful. And that was also at the time when the breeding advances began. So we had ryegrasses, bluegrass, fine fescues, and then tall fescue. And it seemed like it was just all about these grasses. But as time went by, I noticed consistently that in my walks and looking at lawns that what I was seeing wasn't what we were planting. And so I began paying really close attention to uh, lawns as they passed over time. And in doing that, I kind of stumbled onto this whole another world of the changes that occur. So yeah, it's fun to think of lawns as an ecosystem as opposed to a crop. And and in doing that, I've learned an awful lot about what transpires as time goes by.
Wow. So the it's typical to plant. Is it typical to plant lawns with ryegrass in, say, in Portland or Seattle?
Well, it has been for a long time, and that's still really popular. But more recently, people have been trying to plant tall fescue. The assumption is that it's dry here in the summer, and tall fescue has deep roots and it's drought tolerant, so it must be a perfect grass. But what I'm seeing is that it fails just like ryegrass failed, just like Kentucky bluegrass failed, and even the fine fescues eventually fail. So um, I encourage people to consider other options, but nobody seems to look in that direction much.
So
So
what's happening then if oh, I'll use an example. The Oregon State Turf Club, uh, when I was a undergraduate, we did some fundraising projects of various sorts to get money to go to the golf industry show.
hmm
And I remember my aunt's lawn in Salem was in terrible condition, and she paid us to go renovate it. And we I forget all that we did, but I know that we took away the existing grass and we seeded it with ryegrass. And what would you expect to happen to a lawn, because it's not ryegrass now, but what happens from the time that you seed ryegrass in Salem, for example, in a lawn that's irrigated versus a lawn that's not irrigated?
Well, I've got a little slideshow that kind of illustrates this stuff, and I think I can
Oh,
kind of,
cool. Okay.
uh, if you'll
Let
if we can get this thing up and running, then away we go.
okay, let me try to bring this up, and
Do I need to
I
click on it on my side?
I think, yeah, you want to bring up your PowerPoint window.
Okay.
There you go. And so
Okay.
you can. you can show us and explain to us what happens here.
Okay, so I call this lawn ecology, and we'll start basically by looking at the classic map of the United States, which shows the various regions. And of course, if you're from the Northeast and Midwest, you think about the cool, humid region. When you move into the West, you get into the cool, arid or semi-arid region, and then what I call the Pacific coastal region. And so if you look closer from the United States down to Oregon, we can produce a map that looks something like this. And the yellow line is a dividing point, and basically it runs along the crest of the Cascade Mountains until you get down in the Siskiyous, and it sort of loops around Medford, and then further south, and it goes down California right on the coast for the most part. And then up on the Columbia River there, at the top of the screen, there's sort of a V-shaped indentation, and that's where the Columbia Gorge is. And where the point comes, that's right between Hood River and the Dalles. So pretty much the heavily populated parts of the state would be from the coast to the Cascades. So along the coast, we've got the typical coastal climate, and then we've got the Coast Range, and then you can see the green area there, which is the Willamette Valley. So we're right in the center of the valley, and Portland's at the top, and then Eugene would be at the bottom. And so that's this Pacific coastal region that I'm talking about, and that's where most of my work is done. And this sort of gives you a sense of basically how different things are in our Pacific coastal region. So the red line shows that we get a lot of rain in the winter, and it tapers off, or you get into early May, and then from June, July, and August, and part of September are very dry, and then the rains start again in the fall. Whereas in the Midwest or the Northeast, you have a summer rainfall pattern where most of your precipitation occurs during the summer months. And of course, in the winter, you've got snow, which we don't normally have. And then the yellow line shows what it's like in the east side of the Cascade Mountains, where it's basically just dry all the time, even in the winter when it does snow. So we have some functional differences between the Pacific Northwest and other parts of the country. So what I've concluded is as I've looked at lawns for many years, is that basically all lawns transition from the planted grasses to a situation-specific climax vegetation. And that's generally not going to be the grass you planted. So this is that example that I was telling you about in Seattle. I stumbled across this lawn in 2006. It was a brand new perennial ryegrass sod lawn on a newly renovated landscape. So then I've gone back year after year after year to take photos. And if we look at the spring of 2007, you can see what looks like a perfect stand, 100% pure stand of perennial ryegrass.
This was sodded,
I
Tom?
believe it was sodded, yes.
Okay.
And I didn't see it when it actually went in, but looking at it, it has the look and feel of a sodded lawn. I probably saw it a year after it was planted. And so it was well maintained. I always say that new cars are shiny, and people, as you know, you buy a new car, you wash it a lot the first year, and then somewhere along the line, you sort of give up on it. And that's pretty much what we can see with this yard. So this is 2007. If we jump forward to 2010, suddenly it starts to look a little different.
A little, yeah.
A little different, yeah. You've got I think I've got a close up there, yeah. So you can see you still got a lot of ryegrass in there, but it's loaded with dandelions, and that would be both the common dandelion and false dandelion. And something has changed that's allowed the encroachment of those broadleaf components. So then we moved to 2015, and now if you look at it, you can see in this picture there's of course the broadleaf components with the dandelions and such, but you'll also see what looks like spots of different grasses, and most of those are various bent grasses. So we typically see creeping bentgrass and highland type bentgrasses, what we call dryland bentgrass, both of which have the ability to spread over time vegetatively. And the dryland bentgrass is, of course, rhizomatous, which makes it very hardy, even though it's quick to turn brown under drought. So that's in 2015. So now we're 10 years into the lawn, and it's changing quite a bit. And then we go to 2017, and for years the municipalities have encouraged people not to water their lawns, and of course you get into a city like Seattle, that's very important. Can't use a lot of water, and so most people just quit. And as a result, you start to see this. And one of the things that happens with ryegrass is that it's very drought tolerant up to a point, but it doesn't survive dormancy for a long period of time, and so it starts to clump out or thin out over time, and then the drought tolerant broadleaf weeds come in. So this is in the fall of 2017 after the rains had come, and you can see there's some green areas in there, and if you look closer, those are all bentgrass. And then some of the white grass in there might very well be rat-tailed fescue, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So you can see this transition. Let's say we're 12 years into this lawn, and this is what it looks like.
And at this point, it's what? So it's gone 100% ryegrass to what then?
Well, you probably got if you struggle to find 5% ryegrass in this stand, and then you've got predominantly bent grass. There's some velvet grass in there. Haven't seen a lot of Potrobialis and no annual bluegrass. And then you've got a large percentage of everything from clover to a common dandelion to false dandelion. And so that's where you're at with in this case, roughly 15 years from planting. And that's typical. That's kind of the standard operating procedure for any kind of lawn that's planted in the western part of the states.
And where can I ask where that bentgrass came from? Did birds? Was it in the soil? Did birds drop it? Did it come in the irrigation water?
Yeah,
did it blow by the wind?
All of the above. Probably, bentgrass has naturalized throughout the western parts of the Northwest. And there's an awful lot of lawns in the area that don't get mowed, so they actually do go to seed. The seed is small, so it can move with the wind. Your neighbor's cat walks over it, or dog can catch a few seeds. And all of these grasses in this slide that I'm showing now, bentgrass, rough bluegrass, annual bluegrass, velvet grass, they all form what we call persistent seed banks in the soil. And so there's a ready supply of these things in the soil to begin with. So short of physically removing all the soil and bringing in a clean fill that has no seed in it, these are already there. So it's a combination, I think, of a number of different things. And then, as you learned when you redid your aunt's lawn, if you never get all the grass, even though you try to, so some of it comes back pretty quick that way. So anyway, this slide shows kind of the range of grasses and other plants that we see. And of course, you're always going to have some of the planted grasses. You're going to have lots of different mosses. I think I've counted at least a dozen different moss species that we find in lawns. And of course, it's a winter growing plant for us. And then all these eudicots, these broadleaf plants, there's a kind of a standard core of plants you see there. I did want to talk about one grass in particular. That's the Vulpea myuros, or the rat-tailed fescue. And it is a true winter annual, which matches our climate perfectly. You can see on the left that it germinates in the fall when the rains come, and it looks just like any other fine fescue at that stage. And you can fertilize it, you can mow it. It looks actually very nice through the winter. And then it flowers in May and June, and then it just dies. So you can see up in the upper right-hand picture, that's not annual bluegrass. That is rat-tailed fescue after it has completed its life cycle and produced seed that will then supply the stand for next year. This has become an increasingly common component of non-irrigated lawns, and since people have been encouraged to not water their lawns for long periods of time, years now. We're seeing a dramatic increase in the amount of Vulpia that, particularly in parking strips, but also throughout entire lawns.
Wow. Yeah, I remember you taught me about that grass, but I never saw it in big, large stands like that. It was always
Just
present,
here.
but here and there.
Yeah, it has really, it's increased dramatically just in the last 15 years. And it's it's a shame in some respects we can't just use it as a winter overseeding grass, but of course it's not part of the seed trade. Um, so to answer your other question earlier, you either got contaminated seed or sod. Most home lawns are not planted with elite varieties of grass. They go to the local store like Bi-Mart or whatever, and they buy often the cheapest bag that's on the shelf, and that's often dirtier than a nice, clean, professional grade seed mix would be. So some of our stuff, some of these off-type plants come in that, but the seed bank is a really big part of that. And ironically, your longest lived seed banks are from the grasses that produce the smallest seed. So that's why there's one reason there's so much bentgrass to be found. And then just a quick thought on the broadleaf components. We've always treated weeds as something to get rid of, but the reality is they're part of this ecosystem that ultimately evolves, and they all have special characteristics. So like English daisy grows really well from the winter into the spring, and then it simply goes dormant in the summer. So it can tolerate the longest, hottest, driest summers and then look gorgeous in the fall. White clover, of course, comes into poorly fertilized lawns and nitrogen deficient lawns, and it's got pretty good drought resistance during the summer. But it sort of comes and goes over time. Then you've got mousehair chickweed and black medic, and both of those are fall germinating species, which tend to germinate with the onset of fall rains. You can also add to that the subterranean clover, which is a real common component in low input lawns. And then you've got false dandelion and common dandelion, which simply withstand drought through deep tap roots and so on. And they are definitely a stress tolerator. So these are really well adapted to the way lawns are actually maintained here in the Northwest. So I got some rules I've come up with, and one of them is that competition occurs in the cool months. And I think all of our standard recommendations have missed that point because we select tall fescue because it's heat and drought tolerant, but that's only 2 to 3 months in the summer. And the real competition occurs from September through May. And so the grasses that can perform well under those circumstances are the ones that are going to dominate eventually. And then the other one is that the maintenance intensity determines what I call the succession endpoint. And when I'm saying maintenance, usually involves around nitrogen fertility, irrigation intensity, and then whether or not you use herbicides. Most people do not use herbicides, and so that reflects in this broad array of Eudicot plants that we find in lawns. So I've got a little flow chart here that shows what happens to perennial ryegrass. And basically, if you start with the low end side where the green squares are, what you're going to find is that the low nitrogen responsive plants tend to dominate. So that'll be things like bentgrass, moss, clover, and then a host of other plants that tolerate low fertility and again grow during those cool parts of the year. On the other hand, if you manage it intensively with higher nitrogen and then you irrigate, then the grasses that are going to dominate are going to be the ones that are most responsive. And that typically results in annual bluegrass as a dominant grass. But of course, bentgrass, which is very tolerant of low fertility, can also thrive under high fertility. So we often have a mix of annual bluegrass and bentgrass in highly maintained perennial ryegrass lawns. So again, this sort of summarizes what I've seen for years. You start out with a young stand, a few spots here and there. 3 years down the road, they start to get bigger. 5 years, they start to coalesce. And anywhere from 6 to 10 to 20 years, they pretty much become a complete stand of various bent grasses. And these are always a mix. You're generally going to find mostly creeping bentgrass and dryland bentgrass, and then occasionally you'll find some true colonial that Grassus capillaris, but it's never been as widely planted in the Northwest as the highland types have been.
This is fascinating. So I'm gonna come back to a lot of this because eventually I want to talk a little bit about golf. Not
Yeah,
right now, but why on golf courses we start with bent grass and it transitions to something else. But so for lawns, you're saying the climax species with low N is typically going to be bent grass, and with high N, it's Poa annua, but you can also have quite a bit of bent grass in there.
yes, that's exactly what happens. And it's interesting that we like to see gardens, and so we go on a lot of garden tours in the Northwest, from Seattle to Portland or wherever. And it's pretty fascinating. You'll see lawns that have been maintained intensively for 40, 50 years, and they're almost completely annual bluegrass. And then you'll see lawns that are new, and they'll have generally start out with polka dots and lots of things coming in. So it's just a matter of time. But that combination of nitrogen fertility and the amount of water that's applied really seems to influence just how rapidly the transition occurs and then which direction it goes.
That now what so we were talking about what happens west of the Cascade Mountains, weren't
Yes,
we?
yes.
Uh, and we're
So what
talking if
happened
we're
with Spokane?
yeah, let's talk a little bit about Spokane or Pendleton or
Yeah.
Boise or Bend.
Okay. Well, I've looked in these areas too, and so typically when I go to these areas, I go to the older parts of town, and and then I try to correlate that with what might have been planted back in the day and so forth. So in 1954, Oregon State University had a publication on planting lawns, and a standard recommendation, whether you were on the east side of the Cascades or the west side, was to have a mixture of bluegrass and fine fescue and some bentgrass. And the typical bentgrass they recommended was highland bentgrass. So if I go to Spokane up in the Manitou area, which is the older part of town, what I find there is I can find old lawns that are close to 100% bentgrass. So the question is, did that happen naturally, or were they actually planted? And my guess is that in most cases they were planted that way, because you don't have conditions for a natural seed bank of these plants in those climates. It's too dry in the summer for a natural stand to survive that way. So I suspect a lot of those old lawns were actually planted. Um, so, for example, if you go to Pendleton, Oregon, which is up along the Columbia River in the hottest, driest portions of the state, and you go to Fireman's Park, it's virtually 100% bentgrass with other components. But you would look at it and say, this is a bentgrass lawn. Um, if I go to Spokane, I see the same thing in the older parts of town. But on the other hand, if you start with a clean site in those environments and you plant Kentucky bluegrass, tall fescue, perennial ryegrass even, it's possible to keep those pure for a very long period of time because you don't have the natural influx of, um, of these other grasses. And now, an interesting thing I've seen in Bend is that it's not unusual for lawns in Bend to have been planted with sod grown in the Willamette Valley. They do have their own sod farmers over there, and they do a great job. But occasionally, for whatever reason, they'll bring in sod from the west side of the mountains. When that happens, you often bring bentgrass with you. And it's, even though you don't see it as you plant the sod, it's there. And then eventually you got these patches. So kind of one of my concluding thoughts is that when bentgrass is present, it will eventually dominate. And part of that is that it has that tolerance to low fertility, and it has the ability to spread vegetatively. And whereas Kentucky bluegrass, for example, is kind of a reluctant grower. To make it grow and stay green, you got to fertilize it. And the reality is an awful lot of people do not fertilize much. They start out doing that, but then they lose their heart after a while. And so most of our lawns are actually operating under low fertility environments. And so under those conditions, then, go to Manitou Park, for example, you'll find lots of bentgrass there because the bluegrass is not growing vigorously. But if you started clean and worked at it, you could have a very pure lawn for a long time in those climates.
Can we talk a little bit about your lawn in
Yeah,
Corvallis?
yeah. So we moved into our house in 1984. The house was built in 1959, so I'm assuming the lawn was planted probably around 1960. In the front yard, they actually imported some soil, or so it appears. And so I'm guessing that lawn was planted with a mixture that contained highland bentgrass, because today it is probably 90% uh, uh, highland type bentgrasses. There's also some Poa trivialis there. In the shady areas near the trees and close to the house, there's some annual bluegrass. And then I can find a smattering of Kentucky bluegrass. I can find, used to have a few clumps of tall fescue, and I can even find some of the fine fescues. But by far and away, it is 90% of that grass during the summer months is bentgrass.
That's
And
in your front
that's in
lawn.
the front lawn, yeah. And so about almost 20 years ago now, I decided that I was going to see if I could make it work the way I wanted to. And I dethatched it severely and overseeded it with Fresa strawberry clover. So I didn't get rid of the grass. I just opened it up so I could get a catch. And I got a pretty darn good stand. And so over these last 20 years, I haven't fertilized the lawn once.
20,
And
20 years, zero fertilizer.
yeah, and I do return clippings. And but and what I tend to see is that the clover, I do overseed with clover periodically because the stands don't stay constant. They're not like grass. They kind of come and go. The Fresa has stayed pretty strong in about half the lawn, but in another portion that's more severely drought stressed, it hasn't held up. So I overseed in the fall and with the clover about every other year. And I just sprinkle it on the top. I don't do any prep whatsoever. I let the fall rains bring it up. But what I see happening is that in the early fall, I think what happens is the nodules associated with the clover, and it nodulates very nicely, even though I don't always use inoculated seed. They either die off or disintegrate or whatever, but I actually get a flush of nitrogen in the fall. So the quality of the turf is extraordinary in the fall and then again in the spring. And so then the other angle on that is my goal was to figure out how could I maintain this and have it look green, but not irrigate any more than absolutely necessary. And so I've taken a deep and infrequent approach. And my goal would be to irrigate about 4 times a year. And then that varies with the year. So I've been able to get by with as little as 3. And in a really dry year, I've had to go up as 6. And then occasionally I get lucky and there's a rainstorm that comes at a critical time. And so the goal is not to have a lush green lawn, but to have a lawn that's more green than brown. And so as I look in the neighborhood, it stands out even in the summer, as a green lawn compared to others that aren't irrigated and so forth.
With 3 or 4 irrigations per year, which
Yeah, I would say to be really, honest, it'd probably be run 4 to 5 irrigations a year is more common.
so
But when
is
I
that a
used to
three?
irrigate about 16 times a year, so I've reduced my water input significantly.
And so this goes 3 weeks or so. Like
Yeah,
if let's say it stops raining in June, and then describe how
yeah.
that goes through the summer.
Well, it's kind of an interesting thing. In the July to mid-August period, I'm going to irrigate every 2 to 3 weeks. I can generally get 2 weeks, can't always get three. Early and late, I can often get 4 weeks. So there's no schedule per se, just a matter of constantly watch it, and then when it starts to look like it's going to go dormant, I'll get water on it. Um, and then I typically, my strategy is wait as long as I can in the spring, and I've irrigated as early as May and as late as July, just depending on how the spring went. And then I quit as early as I can in the fall. And that typically is Labor Day plus or minus a week. So, the weather's been a little strange in recent years, but still, that's a pretty good target. So, my rule of thumb is if it's green on Labor Day uh, and I irrigate at that time, I won't have to irrigate again. So, in that case, I just wait for the fall rains, and it works quite well.
And when you irrigate, it's on relatively dry soil,
Yep.
and so you must irrigate slow. What would we say? A low application rate of a low precipitation rate, so it doesn't run off. And
Yeah.
how do you handle that? And how much water do you put?
Well, I use hoses and sprinklers, and my rule of thumb is, irrigate the dry spots. So I have a little formula where I set up my sprinklers, just like it's almost like mimicking an in-ground system, but I can adjust that to the areas that tend to be drier than others. And so I'll typically irrigate for 90-minute sets with a gear drive sprinkler. Um, and as far as the actual application rate, I'm clearly getting down at least an inch of water, but it does take a while. It's a relatively low precipitation rate compared to what you would see on a fairway or a spray head system. And so yeah, and then I use a screwdriver to test the moisture of the soil over time, and it's not a bad tool once you get it sort of mentally calibrated as to how hard it is to put the thing in. So
Yes,
I
I
can't give exact numbers, but I do keep track of my water usage in my garden, and it's remarkably constant from year to year. And my goal is always use less next year than I used the year before. So.
that's cool. You sounds like you're managing your lawn like a geo certified facility. Like it's very sustainable, I think, to measure the inputs. So you're measuring your fertilizer inputs, which have been zero over 20
Mhm.
years, and you probably keep track of the mowing. I guess if we would ask about that, you can probably tell
Mhm.
me how many times you mow per year, and you certainly know how much water you're using, and then you
Mhm.
track that over time.
Mhm.
It's a great way to manage, and then you get results that your lawn it stands out in the neighborhood.
Well, there's one other aspect too. When we moved in 1984, the lawn was about 80% fall standing line because it had not been maintained at all for years. And so once I got it green and growing, then I treated that with good old Trimec back in the day. And I followed my own directions, which is 2 applications 3 weeks apart. And that was in 1984. And I haven't treated it since. And I can control any weeds that come up in it just with a screwdriver or a wood chisel is what I use. So, so I've been able to actually, keep the grass dense enough, tight enough that I don't get a lot of weed encroachment, even though all the lawns around me are loaded with with false dandelion and common dandelion and other weeds that can easily move into the area. So
So
yeah, it's been fun.
it's it's fun. It's fun to watch what's growing and how it grows and when it grows. And I think uh, that's really good insight that you have, that the competition is not happening in the summer. The competition happens in the other 9 months of the year when
Yeah.
the temperatures are such that Poa annua can grow, and like everything can grow. And so actually in the summer when it's dry, a lot of things are not growing. So
Mhm.
there's less competition then.
Well, it's interesting if you let's say you're from another part of the country where, say you're from Minnesota, you know, um, you're frozen for the entire winter months, and that being the case, there really isn't any competition that occurs in the winter. So competition becomes a summer phenomena. All you want is a grass that's hardy enough to survive the winter, but your real uh, competition is occurring during what we consider the growing season. But for us, it's just the opposite. And I'll make a quick reference. And my backyard is different, and it was wide open when we moved in, and then we've since developed an extensive garden. But my plan was to develop plant trees so that I would have extensive afternoon shade and then partial shade in the morning. And that has allowed me to get by in the backyard with about, and it's a very nice yard and it's part of our main garden, rarely more than 10 irrigations a year. And I maintain that to a higher standard. But I've been able to minimize my water inputs there because I've got that shade. That really makes a big difference. Until you start getting root competition, and that has to do with where you place the trees. And then I have one other strategy that I use is I don't irrigate the parking strips, and I have other areas. I have what I call the orchard area in the back, which you can't see from the house, so I don't water that. That's where I planted the Bermuda grass.
Right. Let's talk about the Bermuda grass and the Zoysia grass, which is fascinating for me. But first, let's discuss some of the comments and questions that have come up in the chat, which I'm I'm going to try to overlay this on the screen, but when I do that, I don't see it. So
Well, I
if
can see it on the side. Well, how about if I take a look at this one at the top of the list there?
yeah,
It says,
let's yeah, I was trying to show it on the screen.
oh,
Tom and I can see it on our here. So go ahead,
okay, so it
Tom.
says, is there any value to increasing nitrogen fertility in the colder months to promote bentgrass over POA? And my general answer is no, because in a horse race in the fall and winter, um, if you fertilize, POA will be more vigorous. POA annua will be more vigorous, and POA trivialis will be more vigorous than the bentgrass will. So, so my inclination is to say no. I don't think that'll work. I think you'll push it in the direction of annual bluegrass if you do that. Um,
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Jason Haynes from up in Canada, in the Sunshine Coast
mhm.
of British Columbia, said he's seeing a similar transition from rye to bent. Seeing, oh, here he's talking about newer bent grass competing vigorously with low nitrogen throughout the winter. So that
Yeah,
matches with what you just
yeah.
answered.
Take advantage of the fact that your bentgrass will maintain density at lower fertility levels than other grasses. So,
All right. Good. Well, thanks
and then
everybody. We
okay.
see these in the chat. I think so. This is streaming, I believe, on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. I I can't see the ones from Twitter. They don't show up on the Restream software that we're using. I don't see anything from Facebook yet, but I'm seeing the YouTube YouTube comments show up here. So we can sort of monitor it at the same time we're having the conversation. So I appreciate everybody who's watching this live, and feel free to ask us questions if you
Jason
have
made one
them.
more comment, which is a good one. He asked if he's putting low rates of nitrogen down, like a tenth of a pound of nitrogen per thousand per month. I think at those rates, you don't have any problems. You're going to maintain healthy poa annua, and you're not going to overstimulate the poa annua. So yeah, it's funny. We used to say quit fertilizing in the fall completely. Uh, and what we found is that we go through the winter with really weak poa annua, and we go through a weak bentgrass. So provided your rates are not excessive and you're not actually trying to push growth, you can maintain a healthy turf without causing this species shift. But if you get ahead of yourself, then you're going to promote poa annua. I have an interesting observation I want to share. I mentioned that these climax lawns, which look like bentgrass, and they pretty much are, they have other things with them. And of course, Poa trivialis is one of those grasses that's part of that climax group. So I tried an experiment years before I started uh, my current program on my front lawn, and I dethatched it in the spring, and and then I really enhanced the bentgrass as a result, because I did fertilize after that. Then I thought, well, what would happen if I dethatched in the fall? So when you think about it, it was a good illustration. In dethatching in the fall, I basically had thinned out the bentgrass severely. And fall is the time of the year that the Poa trivialis grows very vigorously, fall and winter. And so by the next May, my lawn looked like it was predominantly Poa trivialis. So I learned a lesson. You don't want to upset the apple cart at a time when the bentgrass couldn't recover and the Poa trivialis was moving into its prime season. So I only did that one once.
But we've talked about warm season grasses sometimes. You've sent me pictures and said, could this be seashore paspalum? You found it somewhere. And I've
Yes.
found some interesting old articles from a botanist who I've forgotten the name, who it was something like the grasses of Salem from
Yes.
100 years ago. Just
Yes.
really interesting things that you and I have studied and shared with each other. And I will always remember one of I think it was a grass ID exam, and we used to do that by walking around Corvallis, and
Yep.
you would say, okay, this is question number 7. What grass is this? And we would have to write the grass. And the one that I got wrong was Bermuda grass, because I'd never expected to see Bermuda grass growing wild in Corvallis.
Yep.
So you apparently had planted some Bermuda grass in your lawn to see what would happen. I
I
think
did.
this is in the back lawn,
Yep.
not and you also planted some zoysia, maybe Zoysia japonica. Can
Probably
you
Meyer Zoysia. Yeah.
probably okay? So what happened with those?
Well, first of all, I've been collecting Bermuda grass from all over the Northwest for some time. And of course, as you know, when you get up into Tri-Cities area of Washington and from basically there clear over to La Grande, a lot of Bermuda grass there. So in Walla Walla, for example, you can find Bermuda grass everywhere, and it'll be growing right beside bentgrass. And amazing how many different grasses you can find in one spot. Um, I found a really nice looking Bermuda grass growing in Seattle, which is the last place I thought I would see Bermuda grass. And so I've collected those at home. And then I thought, well, I've got an area in the back that I don't irrigate, that little orchard area. And I should say I don't irrigate it. I might irrigate once or twice a year. Um, and could I get Bermuda grass to grow in these spots that normally completely die out or turn dormant? So I propagated some grass and I planted a couple of clumps of that. And then I actually found a lawn in Corvallis, which was about 75% zoysia grass. Perfect location. It's an irrigated lawn on a slope, south facing, full sunlight. Um, and so I took samples of that and I propagated it, and then I planted it in my own yard. And you predicted that the Bermuda grass would do okay, the Zoysia grass wouldn't. And you were absolutely correct. I babied the Zoysia grass for 2 years, and then I let it fend for itself, and now I can't find it.
I
Um, the
and so
Bermuda
do you
grass has spread significantly.
and how many times did you irrigate this area? It's
Well,
twice a
in
year?
a normal year, about twice. Yeah, my goal is to not have to irrigate, and the Bermuda grass has done well in the hottest, driest location, and it has spread. And so it now what started out as a clump, about 6 inches in diameter, covers a space probably 5 feet by 5 feet. So it's spread significantly, and it perfectly compatible with all the other grasses. So
That's interesting. You know, I'm interested in this topic because I see people look at using zoysia in California, which I think has even less water than Oregon, and I can see Bermuda grass growing wild in California in a lot of places, but I've never seen zoysia growing wild. And you have two things that happen, both the temperature effect and the irrigation or drought stress effect, where Bermuda grass can grow better at low temperatures, I think, than zoysia, even though zoysia can retain its color a bit. It's just not growing. It just sits there. So you need really high temperatures for zoysia to grow well. And it also has the same characteristic that you mentioned with ryegrass, where it can be resistant to drought for quite a while, but if you have long periods without water, it doesn't survive it. Where
yeah,
Bermuda grass does survive it. So what you have is Bermuda grass can actually compete in those kind of conditions, and zoysia grass doesn't, which is why you see Bermuda grass growing wild in Walla Walla, and you don't see zoysia growing wild there. And
yeah,
I think when it comes to managed conditions and intensively managed turf, I think it's better to grow the grass that can grow the fastest, and then cut back the water, cut back the fertilizer, and we can have some amazing conditions, which is kind of what you've done on your front lawn. Is you're
yeah,
growing a grass that's really well adapted, and you cut the fertilizer, cut the water, and it produces the type of surface that you're looking for.
yeah. It's we there's a tendency in the whole turf world to offer recipes. Do this, do that, do this, fertilize 4 times a year, mow a certain height. And it's kind of like an old movie I watched about a guy who burned out of the business world, and he became a tap dancing magician. And so one of the lines from the movie was "Get to know your rabbit," because you had to pull a rabbit out of the hat. And I think that's what we need to do. We get to know your lawn and understand how to make it work with the least amount of input. It's easy to overwater, over fertilize, and do all that, but it's a lot more fun to try to figure out how to get those results with much less input.
And can we transition to talk about golf courses a little bit?
Sure.
Because we've just talked about lawns transitioning from the planted species, which will often be ryegrass. I think tall fescue, you said, is more common recently, but I suppose it transitions to where, what do you end up with? Let's talk about that actually before we talk about
Okay.
golf. Do you end up
Well,
with clumpy ryegrass with bentgrass invading? What do you end up with?
well, the interesting thing is that ryegrass eventually just sort of goes away. It's still there. You can still find ryegrass, but it sort of intermingles with the bentgrass and other components, and you just don't notice it. Tall fescue, because it's coarser texture, it's a bigger plant, it tends to form clumps. And so it really aesthetically isn't very attractive once the conversion happens. And and so it's, in my opinion, is a poor choice. but it's popular because, when you go to the store, you buy what they have to sell, and that's what people want to sell. But uh, given my druthers, I would much rather go with a ryegrass fine fescue mix, knowing that it will transition comfortably, whereas if I plant tall fescue, it'll be an ugly transition.
And that's west of the Cascades in the Pacific coastal
Yeah, if I was
region.
in Central Oregon, for example, the thing I like about tall fescue there, and I think it's a very good grass for that area, is that it doesn't get an aquatic ring spot and it doesn't produce a lot of thatch. I remember years ago, had a field day and I started talking about dethatching, and of course nobody wants to do that. It's a lot of work and it makes a big mess. And this fellow from Central Oregon said, he swore at me and told me what a stupid thing it was because, yeah, you never get rid of thatch. So I went over there to visit, and we went out and looked at lawns, and I began to appreciate what he was talking about. I actually have a photograph I took that shows an 8-inch depth of thatch from a Kentucky bluegrass lawn. And of course, what that means is that somebody planted it and then never did anything to it except water it. And as a rule, people tend to overwater when they water in that climate. And so it just grew a lot of thatch. And so tall fescue doesn't do that. And it has problems under snow with snow molds and such. But in open areas, that would be my grass of choice because I think it's easier to manage in that environment.
Yeah,
But on our side of the hill, it just doesn't hold up.
excellent. There's a lot of microclimates and different zones where different grasses will work, and you definitely have to pay attention to what's happening with
Mm-hmm.
how your grass is responding to the weather and how your grass is responding to the way that you're managing it. And on golf courses, what I've noticed is they get seeded. Let's talk putting greens.
Okay.
Putting greens tend to be grown in let's say in the past 30 years. They would be seeded bentgrass into a sand root zone.
Mm-hmm.
And yet when I go play golf in Western Oregon, I'm generally playing on Poa annua greens, and
Mm-hmm.
they weren't seeded to Poa annua. So why are lawns transitioning to bent grass? Why are putting greens transitioning away from bent grass? And is there anything we can do about it, or do we have to give up? Because I I would say theoretically I can think of some things that I'd like to try, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm in Bangkok right now. I'm not managing grass in the Pacific
Yeah.
Northwest, so I can't try it.
Well, anybody who's followed my work over the years knows that I never viewed annual bluegrass as a bad grass because in reality that's what most of us end up growing. Uh, but yeah, part of it goes back to historical. Think of all the great clubs in the Pacific Northwest. Most of them are very old, and so as a result, they were planted many, many years ago. So they've gone through a lot of incarnations over the years. And the result, of course, now is that many of those golf courses are close to 100% annual bluegrass. So you have this incredible seed bank that's built up not only around greens, but aprons, approaches, tees, everywhere. And so if you were to strip off your putting green and then replant with bentgrass, it would have a constant source of annual bluegrass inoculum coming into it. But let's go to a new golf course and say that you built it in a nice clean site and you built these sand-based greens and then you planted whatever bentgrass you chose. What I've observed historically is that they come up and they're absolutely beautiful and as close to perfect as grass could be. And the tendency is not to do anything. You don't want to core, you don't want to do anything because they're so nice. And what happens, what I feel like I've observed is that on those young greens, they very rapidly build up a thatch layer in the first 2 to 3 years. And so sometimes it can be as much as 2 inches deep. Then you start having problems with localized dry spot. You have spongy, soft greens or whatever else. And then at that point, you figure you've got to do something. And so what happens is people start coring a lot, and then they top dress heavily to fill up the cores, and pretty soon the poa starts to come in and the transition occurs. In the old days, we would get a lot of disease activity, which would further thin out the turf, and so it was sort of a natural process. Today, we do a lot of grooming. We some people vertidrain their greens. We continue to core, and we top dress a lot, and all of that fits in that realm of what we call disturbance. So to the extent that annual bluegrass is in the area, it's going to move in. And again, it's the only grass that can germinate and mature at putting green heights. So you can overseed, interseed, do whatever you want with bentgrass, and it's really difficult to get a mature stand to develop from those seedings. You'll get a lot of seedling germination. You can always pat yourself on the back, but over time, you tend not to get a permanent stand of grass. So I think part of our issues with annual bluegrass are irrigation, fertilization, coring, without a doubt. Our attempts to produce perfect surfaces, which involves a lot of grooming or vertical mowing. All these disturbances really lend themselves to the shift towards annual bluegrass. And I don't know that I have a magic wand. I will say that the newer bent grasses, it used to be that you had 5 to 10 years before the conversion would occur. And today you might get as close to 20 years before it occurs, but it typically occurs. So yeah, it's a tough proposition because our goal with putting turf is to produce a surface. We want firm, smooth, fast surfaces. And as we've lowered mowing heights and done all these other things to get the speed we want, we work that surface more and more. And so given our good environment for annual bluegrass, it's largely inevitable that that's what's going to happen.
But if we consider you said disruption or
Mm-hmm.
disturbance. If we minimize disturbance, do you think bentgrass persists for a longer time? Even it might be inevitable that POA invades, but the bentgrass
Yeah,
would be expected to
I think
last
so.
longer.
Yeah, I think if you can find ways to do less surface disturbance rather than more, you're gonna have a competitive stand longer. And I remember, for years I did chemical research trying to kill annual bluegrass, and I'm fond of saying I was the only person that could ever actually do it, but nobody else seemed to be able to. So maybe I was cheating or something. But I used to define the golf course into zones, and you've got the putting green proper, and then you've got the aprons and approaches. And the aprons in particular have they get all the traffic from putting green mowers, they get all the traffic from apron mowers. There's a lot of things happen there. And then when you move into the approach, which that last 20 yards before you get to the green, those are often intensive sites where you get a lot of overlap with mowers. Many of them are on a slope, and so they're wet and they get compacted. And all of those areas are quick to become poa annua. And so now you've got this it's like the forces have surrounded the green. And so anything that comes and goes basically drags poa annua on there. So for a long time, I thought that your first approach to controlling annual bluegrass on putting greens was to create a clear zone around the greens. And that's where you'd fight your big battle. If you could keep things clean in those areas, you'd have much less inoculum that goes on the putting green. Well, good idea, but I never managed to figure out how to do it. So, and
Oh,
today there may be better technology than there was when I was working.
yeah, that's that. It's something that I'm intrigued by because there's things like keeping the phosphorus low, withholding phosphorus fertilizer that at you would expect poa annua to have stress from that sooner than bentgrass would. Bentgrass would be more tolerant of it. So you could get stress on bentgrass too, but it's going to be more severe and happen sooner on POA. And
Hmm.
the same thing with withholding irrigation, the same thing with keeping your nitrogen low and reducing the ability of the plants to grow. It's just how much are what do you call those cultural practices or uh, yeah, something like that.
Yeah,
Just I call it like the way we manage the grass. If
yeah.
if you do those kind of things, are those effective at all? Because
I think so.
on lawns they would be, but are they effective on greens?
Well, I think they are. One of the fellows just uh, made a note that he got newer cultivars of bentgrass. He's moving away from disturbance, and he's finding that the bentgrass can compete reasonably well with Poa annua, and and I think that there's a big historical component here, which we've all got to understand. When I started uh, in the late 60s working with turf on golf courses, the standard recommendation for fertilizer, if you can believe it, was a pound of nitrogen per month. That's 12 pounds of nitrogen. That's more than people put on in a lifetime today. We were largely working with push-up greens. Top dressing was just becoming a thing, and and then our technology for top dressing and for coring was pretty antiquated. So a lot of those battles were lost, right there. We didn't have good disease control measures, so people would routinely lose 15 to 20% of their turf in the winter due to microdochium patch and primarily. Um, so, so a lot of these places, the, uh, the battles were lost, decades ago. But I think as people have moved into new territory and have become more sophisticated in managing their greens and have again found ways to reduce, you know, routine disturbance that that we've been able to get further with bentgrass. But I would guess that by the time these greens are 80 years old, which many of our old golf courses are in that category, that they, short of being replaced periodically, they will probably become annual bluegrass too. So kind of a it's
Yeah,
not an easy, but I think you can definitely extend the life a long time.
that's yeah. I think with some of the newer bentgrass varieties, they have more density and they can produce that density at lower nitrogen, I think. So and they can be cut at lower mowing heights and still maintain that density. Well, so that produces the type of putting surface that you need to produce. So I think those are all attributes that help bentgrass be able to persist longer.
For a long time, of course, again, you always have to look at the historical part because that's uh, we don't replant a golf course every year. It's sort of you start with where you start, and that kind of dictates your future. But for a long time, we planted highland bentgrass on fairways. We planted pen cross in this part of the country on putting greens. And when you think about it, pen cross comes out of Pennsylvania. It's a grass that does well in the summer. Compared to other things like seaside, it had a high nitrogen requirement, or so we thought. It was coarse textured, so we often did a lot of vertical mowing. If you planted the old Toronto, the C15, before it got sick, um, that was a very aggressive bent grass that had strong stoloniferous growth. And the only ways to manage that was to really go after it. Um, and then, we moved into the cult of sand top dressing, and you and I have talked about this before. There's sand top dressing, and then there's burying your greens in sand. And so we've gone through a lot of these not, I don't call them fads, but shifts in thinking, and each one of those has had an impact then on how those grasses performed. So we have superior grasses today. We have a a greater ability to apply smaller quantities of fertilizer. We understand the role that phosphorus plays. We have better, fungicides, so we can keep our grass healthier for longer. And then we've got things like rolling, which we never had in the past. All of those allow us to produce a surface without tearing it apart. And so I think we'll get further. But again, I would guess that if many of these golf courses that look like they've managed bent grass really well, um, you know, 50 years from now will probably be annual bluegrass, unless they continually replace the sod.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I was at my I mean, I'm just thinking of the contrast between lawns and golf
Yes.
course low cut turf. My brother lives on Orcas Island, in the San Juans, and it was dry there in the summer. I visited him in August a couple years ago, and he didn't mow most of his lawn, and it just looked like a bent grass seed production. And
Yeah.
and it's just like, wow, I didn't know there was that much bent grass in your lawn. And then I go there in the summer, and it's just this beautiful bent grass seed. Uh,
Yeah.
and yet then I'm thinking, the golf course on that island, there's a little 9-hole golf course, putting greens, 100% POA.
Yeah. Well, it's again, you can never discount the historical part of it, because many of those battles were lost 30, 40 years ago. And so now we just have what we have. And I think that's one reason I've always felt that, you know, tell me what you want to grow and I'll work with you on it. But, poi is fine. You learn how to maintain it, and you generally do so with more rather than less inputs. And so it's, I've never viewed it as one or the other. I think they're both just fine. We've all played on those perfect bentgrass greens, but nobody grows POA better than we do in the Northwest. So I mean, it's just
Yeah, I grew up playing on POA greens, and I'm happy to. I really love putting on POA greens, and I make a lot of putts. As those of you who have played with me probably have realized, I make a lot of birdies. But yeah, I guess what's the problem with POA? I've after growing up and going to school in the Pacific Northwest, I haven't worked there since the late '90s. So I mean, I guess the problem with POA is microdochium in the winter. I mean, for most of the year, and then anthracnose in the summer,
mhm.
and needs more water, and I guess dollar spot maybe. So
Yeah. It's interesting. I At the GCSA meetings back in, I guess we were in Tampa Bay. We were supposed to have two sessions. One was on how to kill Poa annua, and the other one was on how to grow it. And my session, of course, was how to grow it. And I went through all of my details and how to manage a fertility and do all this stuff. And every question that anybody had was about killing Poa annua. And these guys were all from the Midwest and the Northeast, and their problem was they just couldn't keep it alive in the summer. Well, you play a lot of golf in the summer, so that was a big problem for them. They also couldn't keep it alive in the winter because it would get so cold that a lot of times they would have either snowball related issues or frost damage. So, but when you come out here, we just don't have either one of those. And, uh, it's incredibly well adapted to our environment, which makes it that much more difficult to try to grow a pure stand of bentgrass. You can do that here. You're doing a heck of a job.
you mentioned, thinking of the historical reasons, and Jason Haynes brought up some history, from the late '90s.
Hmm.
Not too much history, but that's 15 years ago or 20 years ago.
30.
Yeah, yeah, I'm 30. So uh, it says the
9 pounds per
USGA
thousand.
consult suggested nitrogen at 9 pounds per thousand per year, and he says currently he's just over 2 pounds, and it's just right. So nine pounds per thousand is 450 kilograms per hectare or 45 grams per square meter.
That's a
That's
lot of
more than
nitrogen.
that's more than I'd put on Bermuda grass in a tropical climate, and
Well, that
that's
also
for
explains
BC.
why we never heard of anthracnose
Hmm.
until people started to reduce their nitrogen rates because we were growing so much grass. That's also why we had so darn much microdochium. So, I think we have a very astute bunch of superintendents now, more so than in the past, and they're smart enough to figure out how can I dial this down. When you grow less grass, you have to do less things to it up to a point, and so yeah, they kind of figured that out. Jason also made a comment about overseeding, and I think he's right. You if you're going to overseed, you have to do it as part of your ongoing maintenance plan. It's not a one-shot deal. That's a real good comment. Although you can't expect a lot. I mean, it's not like I'm going to plant it and everything's going to be hunky dory. You're going to one step forward and one step back sometimes. But yeah,
Yeah,
keep going.
I I think he's been putting bentgrass in the fairways also, and
Yeah,
maybe on tees, just at really low rates, but at those higher mowing heights, and maybe having the ability to keep it even a little bit drier in those areas
yeah.
than you
There you
would
got a
on
chance.
greens,
Yeah.
then the bentgrass can mature and can form a big part of the sward.
Mhm. I think that particularly when you get to the east side of the Cascades, what I've observed on greens there, which can stay bentgrass for a long time, is that eventually they start having surface sealing problems, and it's a combination of thatch buildup and just natural aging process of the grass, and so at some point they go into accelerated coring, and that's when their transitions occur. And so it's finding a way not to have to do that is the goal. If you go back to the mid 1970s when John Madison, who was at UC Davis at that time, came up with his grand idea to simulate conditions in the British Isles with seaside courses where they top dressed, and that was about all. He'd come up with this elaborate plan where you would mix everything in your top dresser: fertilizer, pesticides, take your pick, and that's all you would do is top dress, and you would try to match the amount of top dressing with the rate of the growth of the grasses. And boy, it sounded like a great idea. And but of course, it didn't work because he put too many things in the bucket. But out of that has come this notion, and I think it's a good one, is that if we can dial in our top dressing and our growth rates and manage our growth rates with minimal fertilizer, that ultimately will give us the kind of surface we want and reduce the intensity of the efforts we make, uh, in managing those greens. Um, so yeah, you just
I'm
you hope you got good guys working on them.
Yeah, I showing a OM246 hashtag, which I think relates to what you're saying about getting just the right amount of top dressing. I don't know, Tom, if you've read any of my blog posts or any of my watched any of my videos about this, but it's a way of testing the organic matter where you don't screen out the thatch. So the, the problem the confusing thing about organic matter testing in the soil, which basically we're doing the top dressing to manage the organic matter,
Hmm.
basically. So when you test the organic matter in the soil, the standard definition for organic matter in the soil is removing all of the undecomposed plant material first. All the all the living and dead plant material that's undecomposed gets screened out of the sample
Hmm.
and discarded and never gets measured, and then you measure the humus that remains. But that's not what thatch is. And so it's been very difficult to track the effect of top dressing from a soil test because you're not getting something that's measuring exactly that. And
Mhm.
the OM246 test that people people have been telling me that this type of testing is really effective, and I was happy doing without it until I if I finally understood the value that it gave. And for the past 5 years or so, I've been doing some research with this and testing with it. It's really interesting to check just in the top 2 centimeters, which is the top 0.8 inches of the root zone. So that's where a lot of the thatch would be on a intensively managed putting green, or not even thatch, but mat and the organic material. And by doing that, if that organic matter number stays static over time, if in October 2020 the number is the same as it is in October 2021, it means that your accumulation rate of organic matter matches your decomposition rate and your removal rate and your dilution rate with the sand top dressing. So you get something. If it stays the same, then it means we're putting the right amount of sand. We're doing the right amount of work. If the number's going up, it means maybe you need to put more sand. And if the number's going down, it means
Mhm.
you're reducing organic matter. I just find this really useful as a way to gauge the effect of the work, because I think back on when I was a golf course superintendent, and I used to put sand but never measure what the effect of it was. And
Yep.
um, I used to do coring just as a matter of habit because I thought the grass needed it, but I wasn't really measuring what the effect of it was in terms of, I was doing it for the purpose of managing organic matter in the soil, but I was never measuring that effect. And
Yeah.
I think one of the tools that's really useful now to really precisely gauge for your site, for your grass, for how fast your grass is growing and how fast your grass is accumulating the organic matter, to then be able to come back and put just the right amount of sand. I find it very useful to measure the organic matter.
Yeah. It's interesting, particularly when you deal with country clubs, is the because of the intense play and the desires of the membership and so forth and so on, that they begin to dictate what you can and can't do at various times of the year. And I noticed one of the things that used to happen was that they would basically push coring further into the earlier in the spring and later in the fall. And so uh, people ended up coring at times when they didn't want to be coring. They would leave the surface open through many months in the winter, and in the spring they wouldn't recover because it was too cold. And so those are additional things that would definitely enhance the likelihood that annual bluegrass would come in. So really what I feel like I'm hearing you say, and I think many of the people listening probably understand this, is that if you can build your program around optimum timing and constant monitoring, that you can kind of get the best of both worlds without, you know, just blasting away on the basis of a calendar date in terms of coring and other other aspects. You know, because if your greens start to get soft and puffy towards the end of the summer, the tendency is to go in and do a lot more verticutting and then load it up with sand. And you may have to do that to achieve the speeds that you want, but it also opens up your surface. So if you can manage it as you pointed out, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I also, yeah, I also have the idea about being reactive rather than proactive, and proactive seems like a good word, and reactive sounds like a bad word. But if we think about being proactive with turf, we never know what the weather's going to be like. That's unpredictable. So to be proactive, we have to do a little bit too much. We we have to err on the side of a little bit too much water, a little bit too much fertilizer,
Yeah.
and then we're being proactive to core, proactive to verticut, proactive to manage that with top dressing. We end up doing, even if it's a tiny bit too much, and it's definitely producing really good surfaces, but the long-term effect could be to favor Poa annua
Yeah.
by being proactive. And I think if we sit back and wait for the grass, we can, it's a different way of thinking, but we can be reactive to how the grass is performing in response to the weather. We can end up doing a little bit less irrigation, a little bit less top dressing, and it's a small difference, but the long term and the cumulative effect could have some difference in what the climax species could be.
Yeah, I think that's true. The other part of that equation is, until recently, at least, our ability to apply water accurately was a limiting factor, and we've gotten better at it. But older golf courses with older systems, often can't do a very good job of applying water without over applying it. And so we find that at the better clubs, the clubs with more resources, they can actually manage with less water because they have better systems. So one of your ongoing goals is to figure out ways to improve your systems so that you don't inadvertently end up putting a lot more water than you want on. Some folks don't have much control at all. Then you go to a golf course that's incredibly well managed, and they've got it dialed in right down to the teaspoonful. So yeah, I feel like the irrigation thing has always been a challenge because if you don't have a great system and you're not able to keep it tuned up, you're gonna be too wet. Oh my God, who are those guys?
Yeah, that's 12 years ago at Tristing Tree Golf Club on a bentgrass tee, I think. That, yeah,
I
that
haven't changed at all, but you've gotten older.
I know my hair is a lot grayer. But
Yeah,
yeah, so there's some irrigation. That's that would be unirrigated rough, I suppose. And I
there you go.
I'm really make a lot of putts, as everybody knows, but sometimes I can be hitting out of the rough. So that I think that may have been the last time we played golf together. And
I think it was.
yeah, see you
Notice that neither one
you're
of us are in the fairway.
yeah, but you were closer to the fairway.
Yeah, I was on
So
green ground. Yeah.
yeah, so that that was a fun round back in 2009, and I hope I will be able to come visit you again sometime soon,
Yeah.
and we can have this conversation in person. But I thank you so much for joining me for this office hours. If anybody has any more questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll try to answer them before we close this out. But yeah, I just find this fascinating. I study this in Thailand and Japan, in this part of the world. I love to look at which grasses grow because I'm not going to talk about carpet grass and zoysia and Bermuda and paspalum, but you see the same things. Uh, I see the transition happen from one species to the other depending on how it's managed.
Well, I'll leave you with a thought. In England, there's an estate called Chatsworth, which is the home of the Duke of Devonshire. It's in Derbyshire, but it's Devonshire. And their lawn is dates back to the 1700s, and it's been continuously maintained without fertilizer and, of course, without water for the most part. And there's uh, an ecologist in England, a guy named Gilbert, who studied that lawn. He found that there was 56 different plant species in that lawn, many of which were woody broadleaf plants, uh, along with many grasses. And so it's extraordinary to realize how ecologically complex lawns can be. And, uh, and it sort of goes from no complexity on putting greens to a lot of complexity when you get to the rough system where you and I play. So that's probably why we're so interested in all this. So,
Yeah, I guess, yeah. That, what is the name of that estate? Chatsworth?
Chatsworth, yeah, you can look
Oh,
it up. There's one large lawn area that is essentially has been in constant cultivation for almost 300 years.
wow,
Pretty,
fascinating.
pretty amazing.
I will look that up. Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with you. The rough is interesting, and I like to study low maintenance turf because it's easy to understand what's happening with high maintenance turf. But if we go look at something that doesn't get irrigation, it's fascinating to see what grows.
Hmm.
If we go look at something that doesn't get mowed, I just had a blog post about Zoysia on roadsides in Thailand. All the medians on Thai highways are sodded with Zoysia, but unless it's irrigated and mowed, it it doesn't remain
Yeah.
Zoysia. And so as you drive around, it's interesting to see what's growing in these low maintenance areas. So, yeah,
So,
all right. Well, thank you very much, Tom. It's always a
yeah.
pleasure
Thank you.
talking with you, and
Yeah.
I
Enjoyed it a
really
lot.
I really appreciate this. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thanks for inviting me.
And yeah, thanks everybody for joining us live in the chat. And if you're listening to this recorded, I hope you'll enjoy it. And we'll be back another time with another ATC office hours. Thank you.